Imagine a morning hushed by dew, where mist curls softly over stone walls and the first light of dawn brushes the petals of blooming herbs. Somewhere in the heart of Europe, centuries ago, a small garden stirred awake, not for show, nor for trade, but for quiet care and daily prayer. This was the monastic garden, tended by monks whose hands knew both the weight of a book and the feel of fertile earth. These gardens grew not in grand estates, but within the sheltered courtyards of abbeys and priories, often enclosed by high walls that kept the world at bay. Inside, every plant had a purpose: sage for sore throats, chamomile for calm, lavender to scent the linens and ward off moths. There were no bright flowers planted merely for beauty, though beauty came anyway, in the symmetry of rose, in the green shimmer of rosemary after rain, in the quiet hum of bees among the thyme. Life in the monastery followed the rhythm of bells, calling the brothers to prayer, to meals, to work. And part of that work was tending the garden. With simple tools and patient hands, the monks turned soil, saved seeds, and watched the seasons turn. They read ancient texts from Rome and Greece that described how to grow and use each herb, copying those words by candlelight onto parchment, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. In winter, the garden slept beneath a blanket of frost, but the memory of its green remained in dried bundles hung from the rafters of the infirmary. In spring, life returned with tender shoots and the promise of healing. The monks did not rush. They planted, weeded, and harvested with the same reverence they brought to their chants and scriptures. To care for the earth was, to them, a form of devotion. Over time, these humble plots became quiet centers of learning and healing. Travelers who fell ill might find shelter and a soothing cup of mint tea. Local villagers sometimes came to ask which root eased a child's fever or which leaf soothed a burn. The garden gave without asking for thanks, just as the monks gave without seeking praise. Though many of those old monasteries are now ruins, their gardens live on in the plants we still grow today, in the parsley on our windowsills, the fennel in our teas, the quiet joy of watching something green rise from the soil. And if you walk through a herb garden now, on a still morning when the air smells of earth and leaf, you might feel, just for a moment, the same peace that once filled those ancient cloisters. Life in the monastery followed the rhythm of bells, calling the brothers to prayer, to meals, to work. And part of that work was tending the garden. With simple tools and patient hands, the monks turned soil, saved seeds, and watched the seasons turn. They read ancient texts from Rome and Greece that described how to grow and use each herb, copying those words by candlelight onto parchment, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. In the scriptorium, where silence was as carefully kept as the inkwells, these plant guides were often bound together with prayers and calendars. One such book, known as a hortulus or little garden, might list not only how to sow rue or hyssop, but also include a short poem praising its virtue. The most famous of these was written by a 9th century monk named Walafrid Strabo, who described his garden at the Reichenau Abbey with such tenderness that you can almost feel the cool soil beneath your fingers as you read his lines. He wrote of fennel standing tall like a sentinel, of lilies glowing white against dark earth, and of how even the humblest weed might hold a secret worth knowing. The garden was divided into neat beds, each marked by low borders of wattle or stone. One section held vegetables, onions, leeks, cabbages for the daily pot. Another held dye plants like woad and madder, used to color the monks' robes. But the heart of the garden was the physic bed, where healing herbs grew in careful order. Here, feverfew bloomed with daisy-like cheer, and valerian sent up its tall, pale flowers, its roots later dried to ease restless sleep. Every plant was known by more than one name, Latin for the books, local names whispered by villagers who came seeking help. Water came from a well or a nearby stream, drawn in wooden buckets and poured gently at the base of each stem. There were no hoses, no sprinklers, only the slow, deliberate rhythm of hand watering, a task often given to novices as a lesson in patience. Even the compost heap was tended with care, for nothing was wasted. Kitchen scraps, spent herbs, and worn-out rush mats all returned to the earth, feeding the cycle that fed the community. And so it was that the garden became more than a source of food or medicine. It was a living prayer. In pruning a rosemary bush or tying up bean vines, the monks practiced humility, attention, and gratitude. They saw God not only in the chapel but in the unfurling of a fern, in the way sunlight dappled through apple boughs, in the quiet miracle of a seed becoming a plant. This was not mysticism removed from daily life. It was holiness rooted in the ordinary. In time, the winds carried this quiet wisdom beyond monastery walls. When plague or famine struck nearby villages, it was often the monks who brought salves and soups made from their gardens. When travelers arrived weary and footsore, they were offered rest and a cup of balm tea to soothe their nerves. And when scholars came seeking knowledge, they found not just books, but living examples of how to grow, heal, and live with care. Even after the great monasteries declined, their gardens left echoes in cottage plots and apothecary shops. The names of herbs, like betony, pennyroyal, and agrimony, passed into folk remedies, and the idea that tending plants could tend the soul lingered in quiet corners of the world. Today, if you grow mint in a pot on your sill or press lavender between the pages of a book, you are touching a thread that stretches back through centuries of quiet hands and watchful eyes. The seasons turned, as they always do, and with each turn the garden spoke a different language. In spring, the air smelled of damp earth and young chervil, and the monks walked the paths with baskets, gathering the first tender leaves for broth. Summer brought heat that shimmered above the thyme and oregano, their oils releasing a warm, resinous scent when brushed by a passing robe. Autumn was harvest time, not just for apples and pears from the orchard beyond the cloister, but for roots and seeds, carefully dug, dried, and stored in clay jars lined along the cool stone shelves of the storeroom. Winter, though barren above ground, held its own kind of work. Mending tools, weaving new baskets from willow withes, and poring over herbals by the glow of tallow candles, planning next year's layout with quiet deliberation. Not all monasteries grew the same plants. A house in Ireland might favor nettles and sorrel, hardy enough for damp, cool soil, while one in southern France cultivated figs and saffron crocus under a gentler sun. Yet certain herbs appeared again and again across Europe: rosemary for remembrance, rue for protection, sage for strength. These were the constants, the shared vocabulary of monastic care. Even the layout often followed a pattern: a central well or fountain, paths forming a cross, beds aligned with cardinal directions. This was not mere practicality. It was geometry shaped by devotion, a small reflection of cosmic order in a patch of earth. Children from nearby villages sometimes watched through the gate, wide-eyed at the sight of men in black robes kneeling among green rows, their rough hands moving with surprising gentleness. Occasionally, an abbot would allow a curious boy to help gather marigolds or turn the compost, teaching him not just which plant cured which ailment, but how to listen to the wind, to the soil, to the quiet rhythm of growth. In this way, knowledge passed like a seed from hand to hand, never shouted, never rushed, but offered softly, like bread at table. There were no grand discoveries made in these gardens, no sudden breakthroughs that shook the world. Instead, there was constancy. Year after year, the same plants returned. Year after year, the same care was given. And in that repetition, something profound took root, not just in the ground, but in the spirit. The monks understood that healing was not always dramatic. Sometimes it was a cup of warm fennel tea for a nervous stomach. Sometimes it was the simple act of watching something grow, day by day, without demanding it hurry. Even now, in the ruins of old abbeys where only fragments of wall remain, wild herbs often spring up where the physic gardens once lay, as if the earth remembers. Walk through the grounds of Glastonbury or Mont Saint Michel, and you might still find self-seated clumps of yarrow or feverfew pushing through the grass, their white flowers nodding in the breeze like quiet keepers of an old promise. In the quiet hours before matins, when the stars still held the sky and the world seemed wrapped in wool, a monk might step into the garden not to work, but simply to be. He would stand barefoot on the cool flagstones, breathing in the night-scented stock or the faint musk of damp moss between the stones. There was no need to speak, no need to write or measure or record. In those moments, the garden was not a place of utility, but of presence, a space where time softened at the edges and the soul could rest without striving. This practice had no name, yet it was as essential as any prayer, for the monks knew that wisdom was not only found in books, but in stillness, in watching how the morning dew gathered on a leaf of borage, or how the shadow of a pear tree lengthened across the path as the sun rose. They noticed which insects visited which flowers, how the soil felt different beneath their fingers after rain, how the wind carried the scent of the sea from miles away. These were not idle observations. They were acts of attention, and attention in its purest form was love. The rule of Saint Benedict, which guided much of monastic life in the West, spoke often of balance, of ora et labora, prayer and work. But it also spoke of stability, staying in one place, tending one community, returning day after day to the same tasks with the same hands. The garden embodied this ideal perfectly. It did not ask for fame or change. It asked only for faithfulness, and in return it gave not riches but resilience, not spectacle but sustenance. Even in times of hardship, when raiders threatened the coast, when frost came too early, when sickness swept through the dormitory, the garden remained a place of refuge, not because it offered escape, but because it offered continuity. As long as there were seeds saved in a dry jar, as long as there was earth to turn, there was hope. And hope in those centuries was often as simple as a sprig of parsley pushing through cracked ground in March. Over the centuries, as printing presses replaced scribes and universities rose beyond monastery walls, the role of these gardens shifted. Some were abandoned. Others were absorbed into larger estates or transformed into ornamental pleasure grounds. But the spirit of the monastic garden never fully vanished. It lived on in the cottage gardens of rural healers, in the apothecary shops of medieval towns, and later, in the botanical gardens of the Enlightenment, where scholars still labeled plants with the Latin names first preserved by those quiet copyists of old. And today, in our own hurried age, the lessons of that gentle tradition whisper still. They remind us that care need not be loud to be meaningful, that healing can grow in small spaces, that to plant a seed is to practice trust, in the earth, in time, in the unseen work that happens beneath the surface. You do not need stone walls or a tonsure to tend such a garden. Only patience, only presence, only the willingness to kneel now and then and place your hands in the soil as if it were a kind of prayer. In the quiet hours before matins, when the stars still held the sky and the world seemed wrapped in wool, a monk might step into the garden not to work, but simply to be. He would stand barefoot on the cool flagstones, breathing in the night-scented stock or the faint musk of damp moss between the stones. There was no need to speak, no need to write or measure or record. In those moments, the garden was not a place of utility, but of presence, a space where time softened at the edges and the soul could rest without striving. This practice had no name, yet it was as essential as any prayer. For the monks knew that wisdom was not only found in books, but in stillness, in watching how the morning dew gathered on a leaf of borage, or how the shadow of a pear tree lengthened across the path as the sun rose. They noticed which insects visited which flowers, how the soil felt different beneath their fingers after rain, how the wind carried the scent of the sea from miles away. These were not idle observations. They were acts of attention, and attention in its purest form was love. The rule of Saint Benedict, which guided much of monastic life in the West, spoke often of balance, of ora et labora, prayer and work. But it also spoke of stability, staying in one place, tending one community, returning day after day to the same tasks with the same hands. The garden embodied this ideal perfectly. It did not ask for fame or change. It asked only for faithfulness, and in return it gave not riches but resilience, not spectacle but sustenance. Even in times of hardship, when raiders threatened the coast, when frost came too early, when sickness swept through the dormitory, the garden remained a place of refuge, not because it offered escape, but because it offered continuity. As long as there were seeds saved in a dry jar, as long as there was earth to turn, there was hope. And hope in those centuries was often as simple as a sprig of parsley pushing through cracked ground in March. Over the centuries, as printing presses replaced scribes and universities rose beyond monastery walls, the role of these gardens shifted. Some were abandoned. Others were absorbed into larger estates or transformed into ornamental pleasure grounds. But the spirit of the monastic garden never fully vanished. It lived on in the cottage gardens of rural healers, in the apothecary shops of medieval towns, and later in the botanical gardens of the Enlightenment, where scholars still labeled plants with the Latin names first preserved by those quiet copyists of old. And today, in our own hurried age, the lessons of that gentle tradition whisper still. They remind us that care need not be loud to be meaningful, that healing can grow in small spaces, that to plant a seed is to practice trust in the earth, in time, in the unseen work that happens beneath the surface. You do not need stone walls or a tonsure to tend such a garden. Only patience, only presence, only the willingness to kneel now and then and place your hands in the soil as if it were a kind of prayer. In fact, many of the herbs once grown in monastic plots now thrive in unexpected places, on urban balconies, in community plots, even in window boxes overlooking busy streets. A pot of thyme on a kitchen sill carries the same quiet dignity it once did beside a cloister wall. A sprig of mint stirred into water offers the same refreshment it did to a weary pilgrim centuries ago. The continuity is real, though rarely noticed. It flows not through monuments or grand narratives, but through small, repeated acts of tending. The monks themselves rarely signed their names to the texts they copied or the gardens they shaped. Their work was meant to serve, not to be remembered. And yet, in a quiet paradox, their anonymity became a kind of immortality, because what they preserved was not themselves, but knowledge, living knowledge that could be passed on, used, and renewed by others. A recipe for wound salve using yarrow and honey, written in the margin of a psalter, might save a life 100 years later. A note about planting garlic near roses to deter aphids might find its way into a farmer's almanac centuries hence. This is the quiet power of the monastic garden. It was never about control, but about cooperation, with the seasons, with the soil, with the needs of body and spirit. The monks did not seek to dominate nature. They sought to listen to it. And in listening, they learned how to live with less fear, less haste, and more grace. Consider the way they harvested. They never took all of a plant. Always they left some leaves, some flowers, some roots, enough for the plant to recover, enough for bees to feed, enough for seeds to scatter. This was not merely practicality. It was ethics made visible. It was a daily practice of restraint, of giving back even as they took. In a world that often measures worth by accumulation, this gentle economy of enough remains radical. Even their tools reflected this ethos. A wooden dibber for making holes in the soil, a wicker basket for gathering, a simple iron trowel worn smooth by use, nothing flashy, nothing wasteful. Each object had a place, a purpose, and a lifespan. When a handle broke, it was repaired. When a basket frayed, it was rewoven. Waste was not just impractical, it was disrespectful. To waste was to forget the labor of the earth and the hands that tended it. And the garden itself taught humility. No matter how carefully a monk planned his rows or amended his soil, the weather had the final say. A late frost could blacken young shoots. A summer drought could parch the lettuce. A sudden downpour could wash away newly sown seeds. The monks accepted these losses not with despair, but with quiet resolve. They replanted. They adapted. They trusted that the earth in its own time would provide again. This rhythm of loss and renewal mirrored the spiritual life. Just as a garden must lie fallow to regain its strength, so too must the soul. Periods of dryness, of doubt, of apparent barrenness were not failures, but necessary phases in a deeper cycle. The monks understood this because they saw it in the soil every year. They knew that beneath the surface, even in winter, life was preparing to rise again. In the infirmary wing of the monastery, the garden's gifts were most tenderly applied. An elderly brother with aching joints might be given a poultice of comfrey leaves. A novice with a fever would sip a decoction of willow bark, nature's own aspirin, long before chemists isolated salicin. A traveler with a cough might rest under a wool blanket while breathing in steam infused with eucalyptus or hyssop. These remedies were not magic. They were born of long observation, of trial and error, of generations of quiet watching. And always the care was given without expectation. No coin changed hands. No ledger recorded who owed what. Healing was offered as freely as the rain. This was not charity in the modern sense, but kinship, the understanding that all beings are bound together, and that to ease another's suffering is to honor that bond. The layout of the garden itself reinforced this sense of connection. Paths crossed at right angles, forming a living cross that echoed the one worn over the heart. At its center often stood a small statue of the Virgin Mary or a carved stone basin where water collected after rain. This was not decoration. It was orientation. It reminded the gardener that his work was part of something larger, a sacred geometry that linked heaven and earth, spirit and soil. Even the names of the plants carried meaning. Lungwort, with its spotted leaves, was used for respiratory ailments, a reflection of the ancient doctrine of signatures, which held that a plant's appearance hinted at its purpose. Self-heal, with its modest purple flowers, was believed to close wounds. Heartsease, or wild pansy, was brewed into tea for sorrow. These names were not scientific but poetic, and poetry, to the medieval mind, was another form of truth. As centuries passed, some of these beliefs were refined or set aside, but the core insight remained, that the natural world speaks if we learn to listen, and the monastic garden was a school for that listening. In our time, we have forgotten much of this language. We speak of efficiency and yield, of pest control and optimal growth. We measure success in harvest per acre, not in the quiet joy of watching a bee alight on a flower. And yet, the longing for connection remains. It surfaces in the popularity of houseplants, in the rise of forest bathing, in the quiet pride people take in growing a single tomato on a fire escape. Perhaps what we miss is not the garden itself, but the mindset it fostered, a way of being in the world that is slow, attentive and reciprocal. The monks did not see themselves as owners of the land, but as guests, stewards, not masters. And in that posture of humility, they found a kind of abundance that cannot be counted in bushels or sold at market. It is this abundance that still waits for us if we are willing to kneel, to plant one seed, to water one row, to sit quietly and watch the light change on a leaf. The monastic garden was never about grandeur. It was about showing up, day after day, with open hands and a quiet heart. And in that simple act, it offered a vision of life that was whole, not because it was perfect, but because it was rooted in place, rooted in care, rooted in the deep, slow truth that to tend the earth is to tend ourselves. The garden in its quiet constancy became a mirror, not of vanity, but of inner weather. A monk who rushed through his tasks would find his seedlings stunted, his rows crooked. One who worked with agitation might snap a delicate stem without meaning to. But the brother who moved slowly, who paused to feel the moisture in the soil or watch a ladybug climb a stalk of fennel, often found his plants thrived, not because he was more skilled, but because he was present. Presence, it turned out, was its own kind of nourishment. This was never taught in words. It was learned through repetition, through the ache in the shoulders after turning compost, through the satisfaction of a neatly tied bundle of dried lavender hanging in the rafters. The garden did not flatter. It did not lie. It simply responded, faithfully, honestly, to the care it received. And in that honesty, it became a teacher. In winter, when the garden slept beneath a quilt of snow or bare frost, the work turned inward. The monks would gather in the warming room, mending nets for seed sowing, braiding garlic into long plates, or grinding dried roots into powders for spring remedies. Stories were shared then, quiet tales of saints who healed with herbs, or of abbots who could tell the weather by the behavior of ants. These were not myths meant to dazzle, but threads of lived wisdom, passed like warm bread from hand to hand. Sometimes a visiting bishop or noble would tour the monastery and marvel at the order of the garden. "How do you keep it so neat?" he might ask, and the gardener monk would simply bow and say, "By walking it every day." There was no secret formula, no hidden technique, only consistency, only showing up. And that perhaps was the deepest lesson. In a world that often glorifies the extraordinary, the miracle, the breakthrough, the genius, the monastic garden celebrated the ordinary, the daily, the small. It said, "What you do today matters even if no one sees it, even if it seems to change nothing, because tending is itself a form of hope." Consider the act of saving seeds. At summer's end, the monks would select the healthiest plants, the plumpest beans, the straightest carrots, the most fragrant chamomile flowers, and let them go to seed. They would gather the pods or heads, dry them in the shade, and store them in labeled pouches of linen or parchment. This was not just practicality. It was an act of trust in the future. A quiet vote of confidence that there would be a next spring, a next planting, a next generation to receive these tiny promises wrapped in husks and pods. In times of plague or war, when travel was dangerous and supplies scarce, these saved seeds became lifelines. A monastery might send a pouch of onion seeds to a neighboring village whose crops had failed, or trade a bundle of sage for salt or candle wax. These exchanges were rarely recorded in ledgers. They were part of an unspoken economy of care, woven into the fabric of rural life. Even the boundaries of the garden held meaning. The walls were not meant to exclude, but to create a sacred threshold, a place set apart where attention could deepen. Within those walls, time moved differently. The rush of the outside world, the clamor of markets, the clash of swords, the demands of lords, faded into silence. Here, a man could hear his own breath, could notice how the light shifted from gold to silver as afternoon turned to evening, could feel the weight of his own thoughts without distraction. This is why the garden was often adjacent to the cloister walk, the covered arcade where monks paced during meditation. As they walked, they could glance through arches and see the green beds below. The sight of growing things became part of their prayer, not a distraction but an anchor, a reminder that growth is slow, that healing takes time, that even in stillness, life is unfolding. And the scents were a language all their own. On a warm day, the air might carry the sharp green tang of crushed rue, said to ward off evil spirits and eye strain. After rain, the earthy perfume of wet wormwood rose like incense. In late summer, the sweetness of ripening quinces from the orchard mingled with the peppery note of nasturtiums climbing the wall. These aromas did not shout. They whispered, and in their whispering, they calmed the mind. Modern science now confirms what the monks knew by instinct. Certain plant scents can lower heart rate, ease anxiety, improve sleep. Lavender's linalool, rosemary's camphor, lemon balm's citronella. These compounds interact gently with our nervous systems. But the monks did not need chemistry to understand this. They felt it in their bones. They saw it in the way a troubled novice grew quieter after walking among the herbs. Even the sounds of the garden mattered. The buzz of bees among the borage, the rustle of leaves in a soft wind, the distant clink of a watering can against stone. These were not noise but music, a subtle symphony that soothed without demanding attention. In a world before recorded sound, such natural harmonies were precious. They filled the silence not with distraction but with companionship. And so the garden became a sanctuary not just for plants but for people. Pilgrims on their way to distant shrines might rest here for a night, given a pallet in the guest house and a bowl of herb broth. They would wake to the sound of birds and the smell of baking bread, and for a moment, their burdens would feel lighter, not because their troubles had vanished, but because they had been held, however briefly, in a space of peace. This is the legacy that endures, not in grand monuments, but in the quiet spaces we still create. A windowsill herb garden, a patch of wildflowers left unmown, a single potted rosemary on a balcony. Each is a small echo of that ancient cloistered plot, a testament to the human need for places where we can simply be, without performing, without producing, without proving our worth. The monks never claimed to have invented this wisdom. They inherited it from Roman villa gardens, from Greek physicians, from Celtic herbalists who knew the language of roots and stones. And they passed it on, not as dogma, but as practice. As something to be lived, not just believed. Today, as we face ecological uncertainty and digital overload, that practice feels more vital than ever. The monastic garden offers no quick fixes. No apps, no algorithms, no 5-step plans. Only an invitation to slow down, to pay attention, to plant something, however small, and care for it without expecting immediate return. In doing so, we join a lineage far older than we realize. We become part of a quiet river of tenders, monks, healers, farmers, mothers, children, who have, for centuries, knelt in the dirt and whispered to the green world, "I am here." And the green world, in its patient way, has always whispered back. That whisper was never loud. It came in the unfurling of a fern in April, in the way mint spread its roots beneath the soil even when no one was watching, in the quiet persistence of a dandelion pushing through a crack in the cloister stones. The monks did not need to hear words to understand. They learned to read the language of light and leaf, of moisture and decay, of bloom and rest. And in learning it, they found a rhythm that matched the pulse of their own hearts. This rhythm was not imposed from outside. It arose from within the cycle of the year, from the tilt of the earth, from the slow dance of sun and rain. The monks aligned their lives to it, not with rigidity but with reverence. They knew that forcing a plant to grow faster only weakened it, that pulling a root too soon meant losing its full strength. So they waited, they watched. They trusted the timing of things beyond their control. In this, they practiced a form of surrender that was not passive, but deeply active. Surrender meant showing up even when the harvest looked uncertain. It meant watering the beds during drought, not because they knew rain would come, but because care was its own reason. It meant accepting that some years the apples would be few, and other years they would bend the branches low, and both were part of the same truth. This wisdom seeped into their spiritual lives as naturally as rain into soil. When a brother struggled with doubt, the abbot might not offer a sermon, but suggest he spend a week weeding the sage bed. In the repetitive motion, in the scent of the leaves, in the simple act of clearing space for life to breathe, clarity often came, not as a lightning strike, but as a slow dawn. Even their prayers reflected the garden's cadence. The liturgy of the hours, chanted at set times from dawn to night, mirrored the sun's journey across the sky, just as planting followed the waxing moon and harvesting the waning one. Time was not a line to be raced along, but a circle to be walked with care. Each day was not a step toward some distant goal, but a return to the same sacred ground, made new by attention. And the ground itself was holy, not because it was consecrated by a bishop, but because it gave life. The monks kissed the earth on Good Friday, not as a symbol, but as an acknowledgement. This soil held the bones of their ancestors, fed their bodies, and would one day receive them back. To tend it was to honor the great cycle of giving and receiving that binds all living things. In the scriptorium, where manuscripts were copied by hand, the ink was sometimes mixed with rainwater collected from the cloister roof. The parchment came from lambs raised in the monastery fields. Even the red pigment for initials, the precious rubric, might be made from madder root grown in the dye bed. Every part of their work was entangled with the land. Nothing was separate. This wholeness was their quiet rebellion against fragmentation. In an age of war and upheaval, when kingdoms rose and fell like wheat in a storm, the monastery offered a different kind of order, one rooted not in power but in relationship. The gardener did not command the earth. He conversed with it, and in that conversation he found a kind of peace that no fortress could provide. Visitors often remarked on the silence of the monasteries, but it was never true silence. It was filled with the soft sounds of life, the scratch of a quill, the drip of water from a spout, the coo of doves in the eaves, the distant lowing of cattle in the pasture beyond the wall. The silence was not emptiness, but fullness held gently. And the garden was at the heart of that fullness. Even in winter, when snow blanketed the beds and the only green was the ivy climbing the chapel wall, the garden was not dead, only dreaming. The monks knew this. They stored bulbs in sand, tucked rose cuttings into sheltered corners, and marked the places where next year's garlic would rise. They planned not in months, but in seasons, not in quarters, but in lifetimes. This long view shaped everything. A pear tree might take 20 years to bear fruit, but a monk would plant it anyway, for his brothers, for strangers not yet born, for the sheer rightness of a tree in the world. There was no expectation of personal reward, only the quiet joy of participation in something larger than oneself. In our time, such patience seems almost impossible. We want results now, yesterday if possible. We measure success in likes, in clicks, in quarterly reports. But the monastic garden reminds us that some things cannot be rushed. Trust cannot be manufactured. Healing cannot be scheduled. Wisdom cannot be downloaded. They grow slowly, like roots in the dark. And yet they do grow, given time, given care, given the courage to keep tending even when nothing seems to happen. That is perhaps the most enduring gift of the monastic garden. It teaches us how to wait well, not with clenched teeth, but with open hands, not with anxiety, but with quiet faith in the unseen work of becoming. For every seed buried in darkness believes without proof in the light. And so it was with the monks who planted not only in soil, but in time. They sowed seeds of knowledge, of compassion, of quiet resilience, often without knowing who would reap them, or if anyone would at all. Yet they planted anyway, because planting was an act of hope, and hope, in its purest form, does not demand guarantees. It simply reaches toward the sun, even when the sky is clouded. In the long centuries between the fall of Rome and the dawn of the Renaissance, when much of Europe trembled under the weight of famine, plague, and war, the monasteries stood as islands of continuity. Not because they were impervious to suffering, many monks died in the very plagues they sought to heal, but because they refused to let care die. Even when the world seemed to unravel, they kept their gardens. They kept their books. They kept their vows of stability, hospitality, and humility. This steadfastness was not born of stubbornness, but of deep listening. The monks understood that chaos is not the opposite of order, but its necessary counterpart. Winter must come before spring. Decay must precede renewal. And so, in times of turmoil, they did not panic. They turned the compost. They saved the seeds. They lit the lamps in the infirmary. They trusted that life, however battered, would find a way to return. Their gardens became living libraries, texts written not in ink but in leaf and root. A bed of rue was a chapter on protection, a row of fennel, a verse on digestion and clarity, a clump of yarrow, a stanza on staunching wounds. To walk through the garden was to read a book that changed with the seasons, that spoke in scent and texture and color, that required no literacy but attention. And attention, as they well knew, was a form of love. To truly see a plant, to notice how its leaves angle toward the light, how its stems strengthen after wind, how it shares space with its neighbors, was to honor its dignity. The monks did not see plants as resources to be exploited, but as companions in the great web of creation. They spoke to them softly as they worked, not out of superstition, but out of habit formed by reverence. This relationship was reciprocal. Just as the monks gave care, the garden gave back, not only in herbs and food, but in solace. On days when grief weighed heavy, perhaps after burying a brother or hearing news of a village burned by raiders, a monk might sit on the garden bench and simply breathe. The steady rhythm of growth around him, indifferent to human sorrow yet deeply intertwined with it, offered a strange comfort. Life went on, not untouched by pain, but not defined by it either. Even the weeds held lessons. The monks did not hate them, though they pulled them diligently. They recognized that what one called a weed, another might call medicine. Dandelion, so often cursed in lawns, was prized for its liver-cleansing roots. Plantain, trampled underfoot on paths, could draw out infection from a splinter. Nettles, stinging and unwelcome, made a nourishing soup rich in iron. Nothing was truly useless, only misunderstood. This perspective shaped their view of people as well. No soul was beyond redemption, just as no plant was beyond use. The monastery gates were open to the outcast, the broken, the lost. A thief might be given bread and a place to sleep. A runaway might be offered shelter and silence. A grieving widow might be invited to help dry herbs in the still room. In the garden's economy, everyone had something to give, even if it was only their presence. The still room itself was a sanctuary within the sanctuary, a small, cool chamber where the garden's bounty was transformed. Here, rose petals became syrup for coughs. Elderflowers steeped in vinegar made a gentle tonic. Apple peel and mint simmered into a fragrant infusion for digestion. Every jar, every bottle, every bundle was labeled with care, not for inventory but for intention. This was not production. It was devotion made tangible. And the scents that rose from the still room, warm, herbal, slightly sweet, drifted through the cloister like invisible prayers. They lingered in robes, in hair, in the pages of books. Long after a monk had left this life, his brothers might open a chest and catch the faint ghost of lavender or sage, and for a moment he would be present again, not in memory alone, but in the very air. This is how the garden preserved not only knowledge but kinship. It wove the community together through shared labor, shared meals, shared remedies. When one brother fell ill, others brought him broth made from garden vegetables. When a novice struggled with Latin, an elder might teach him plant names instead. Salvia, mentha, oreganum, as a gentler path into learning. The garden was a classroom without walls, a hospital without beds, a chapel without an altar. And always it pointed beyond itself. The beauty of a blooming borage flower was not an end, but a doorway to wonder, to gratitude, to the mystery of life's resilience. The monks did not worship the garden, but in tending it, they practiced a kind of worship. They saw in its cycles the hand of a creator who delighted in detail, who clothed the lilies in splendor not for show, but simply because it was good. This goodness was not abstract. It was in the warmth of sun on stone after rain, in the crunch of a freshly pulled carrot, in the way bees hummed contentedly among the thyme. It was ordinary and therefore holy. Centuries later, when we walk through a botanical garden or pause to smell a sprig of rosemary from the market, we touch that same holiness, however faintly. We may not know the names of the monks who first saved these seeds, who first wrote down that feverfew eases migraine, who first planted lavender by the infirmary door, but we benefit from their quiet faithfulness. And perhaps in our own small ways we can continue it, not by building cloisters but by cultivating attention, by planting one thing and caring for it without expectation, by noticing the way light falls on a leaf, by saving seeds, not just of plants but of kindness, of patience, of slowness. For the world still needs gardens, not only of herbs and vegetables but of peace. Spaces where time slows, where care is practiced without fanfare, where life is honored in all its fragile, persistent forms. The monastic garden was never about escaping the world. It was about tending it, one seed, one soul, one quiet moment at a time. And that work is never finished. It simply waits for willing hands. It waits not in grand gestures but in the smallest acts of return. A hand brushing soil from a harvested beet, a whispered thanks to the earth before turning the compost, a pause, just for a breath, beneath the boughs of an old pear tree whose fruit has fed generations. These are the gestures that stitch the world back together, thread by quiet thread. The monks knew that healing was rarely sudden. It seeped in like rain through dry ground, slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one day the whole field was green again. So they practiced what we might now call slow care. They did not rush a poultice onto a wound before it was properly cleaned. They did not harvest mint before its oils had peaked at dawn. They understood that timing was part of the medicine. This applied to people as much as plants. A troubled soul was not given a lecture but space. A novice overwhelmed by the rigors of monastic life might be assigned to weed the chamomile bed for a week, not as punishment but as therapy. The repetitive motion, the scent of the crushed leaves, the absence of expectation, these were balm enough. And often, by the end of the week, the young man would return to his duties not because he had been fixed, but because he had remembered how to breathe. Even the layout of the paths invited slowness. They were narrow, just wide enough for one person, winding gently rather than cutting straight. This was no accident. A straight path encourages speed. A curved one invites pause, and in that pause, perception deepens. You notice the spider web glistening with dew. You hear the distant call of a thrush. You feel the coolness of the stone beneath your sandals. The garden was designed not for efficiency, but for presence. And presence over time becomes prayer. Not the kind spoken in words, but the kind lived in gesture. The act of watering a row of leeks at dusk, when the air is soft and the light golden, becomes a liturgy. The careful tying of bean vines to their poles becomes a meditation. The sorting of seeds by candlelight becomes an offering. This is why the garden was never separate from the chapel. They were two expressions of the same devotion. One lifted hands in praise, the other placed them in the soil. One sang to the heavens, the other listened to the earth. Both were necessary, both were holy. In the long winters, when the garden slept and the days were short, the monks turned inward, but not away. They studied the herbals, yes, but they also remembered. They recalled the taste of the first lettuce of spring, crisp and cool, the weight of a sun-warmed squash in the hand, the way the bees buzzed drowsily in the lavender at high noon. Memory became a kind of tending, keeping the garden alive in the mind until it could bloom again in the world. And when spring returned, as it always did, the joy was quiet but profound. Not a shout, but a sigh of relief. The first green shoot breaking through last year's mulch was greeted like an old friend. The monks would gather to bless the seeds before sowing, not with elaborate ceremony, but with a simple prayer. May what we plant serve life. That intention shaped everything. Nothing was grown for vanity. No rare orchid was cultivated for show. Every plant had a role: nourishment, healing, dye, scent, or simply the quiet work of holding the soil together with its roots. Even the flowers were chosen for their usefulness. Calendula for wounds, violets for coughs, marigolds to deter pests. Beauty was not excluded, but it was never the goal. It was a gift that came unbidden, like grace. This ethos extended to the tools. A trowel was not replaced at the first sign of wear, but sharpened, oiled, and used until the handle was smooth from years of grip. A basket was mended with willow shoots from the riverbank. Waste was not just avoided. It was seen as a kind of violence against the gift of creation. To discard what could still serve was to forget that all things are borrowed, not owned. And the earth itself was treated as a guest, not a servant. The monks rotated crops to let the soil rest. They mixed ash from the hearth and manure from the stables into the beds, returning what had been taken. They planted legumes to fix nitrogen, though they did not know the word for it. They simply observed that peas and beans left the ground richer for the next planting. Their science was empirical, humble, and deeply respectful. This respect flowed outward. When villagers came seeking help, they were never turned away. A mother with a feverish child might be given a bundle of elderflowers and instructions to steep them in hot water. A farmer with aching joints might leave with a jar of comfrey salve. No coin was asked, only a promise: if you are able, pass this on. In this way, the garden became a node in a vast, invisible network of care, one that stretched far beyond the monastery walls. Its influence was not measured in acres or yields, but in lives eased, in knowledge shared, in seeds exchanged at market. A single pouch of caraway seeds, given to a traveling merchant, might find its way to a kitchen in Bruges or a sick room in Prague. The garden's reach was quiet, but it was wide. And always it returned to silence, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of fullness held gently. In that silence, a man could hear his own thoughts without fear, could feel the ache in his bones without rushing to numb it, could sit with sorrow or joy or nothing at all and simply be. This is perhaps the garden's greatest gift. It offers a place where we do not have to perform. We do not have to be productive, impressive, or useful in the world's terms. We only have to show up, with open hands, with patient eyes, with a willingness to listen. And in that listening, we remember who we are, not masters of the earth, but participants in its ancient, unfolding song. The monks are long gone from many of those old abbeys. The walls crumble, the scriptoriums stand empty. But if you walk those grounds on a still morning, you may find wild chamomile blooming where the physic garden once lay, or a gnarled pear tree still bearing fruit, its roots deep in soil that remembers every hand that ever tended it. And if you kneel there, even for a moment, you join a lineage of tenders who believed, without proof, without fanfare, that care matters, that slowness is sacred, that to plant a seed is to say gently to the future, I trust you. That trust is still needed, perhaps more than ever. So plant something, water it, watch it. Let it teach you how to wait, how to give without expecting return, how to find holiness in the ordinary. It is waiting not in some distant, idealized past, but right here, in the crack of a city sidewalk where a dandelion pushes through, in the pot of basil on a fire escape, in the community plot where neighbors trade zucchini and stories. The spirit of the monastic garden was never confined to stone walls or tonsured heads. It lives wherever someone chooses to tend with patience, to listen with humility, to give without keeping score. And that choice is always available. It does not require acres of land or vows of silence. It only asks for attention, for a moment of stillness, for the willingness to notice that the mint on your windowsill is reaching for the light, just as you are. The monks understood that tending is a form of kinship. When you care for a living thing, whether a plant, an animal, or another person, you enter into a quiet covenant. You say without words, I see you. I will not abandon you. I will show up even on days when nothing seems to happen. And in that showing up, something shifts, not just in the one being tended, but in the one who tends. This is the hidden reciprocity of care. The gardener heals the soil, and the soil heals the gardener. The hand that pulls weeds grows calmer. The mind that watches bees forgets its worries, if only for a while. The heart that gives without expectation becomes lighter, freer, more open to grace. In our age of constant connection and relentless productivity, this kind of slow reciprocity feels almost radical. We are told to optimize, to scale, to measure return on investment. But the garden whispers a different truth. Some of the most important work leaves no trace but peace. Consider the act of composting, a practice the monks perfected long before the word existed. Kitchen scraps, fallen leaves, spent herbs, even worn-out rush mats, all were gathered and layered with care. Nothing was thrown away. Everything was given time to transform. What was once waste became nourishment. Decay became renewal. This was not just practical, it was theological. It mirrored the Christian hope of resurrection, not as a sudden miracle, but as a slow unfolding. Death feeds life. Loss becomes soil. And from that soil, new growth rises, not identical to what came before, but shaped by it, carrying its memory in every cell. The monks did not speak of this in sermons. They lived it in the turning of the compost heap, in the dark, quiet work of transformation that happened out of sight. They knew that healing, like compost, requires darkness, moisture, time, and the right mix of elements. And that rushing it only produces stench, not fertility. So they waited. They turned the pile gently, adding straw for air, water for moisture, patience for time. And in due season they were rewarded with rich, crumbly humus, the color of chocolate, the smell of forest after rain. This they spread on their beds, knowing it would feed not just plants but generations. This long view shaped their entire ethos. They planted trees they would never sit under. They copied books they would never read in full. They taught novices who might one day surpass them. Their legacy was not in monuments but in continuity, in the quiet passing of a seed, a recipe, a way of seeing. And that way of seeing is still accessible. It begins with a single question: what needs tending? not what can be fixed, not what can be monetized, but what simply needs care. A patch of earth, a weary friend, a neglected part of yourself. The garden teaches that care is not a grand gesture. It is daily. It is small. It is showing up even when you're tired, watering the seedlings even when rain is forecast, pulling one more weed before the light fades. These acts do not change the world in a day, but over time they change the ground, and from changed ground new worlds grow. Even in failure there is teaching. A crop might fail, a frost might come too soon, a pest might devour the beans. The monks did not despair. They observed, they adapted, they saved what they could, and they planted again. Because to stop planting is to surrender to fear, and fear, they knew, is the opposite of faith. Faith is not certainty. It is the willingness to place a seed in the dark and trust that the conditions for life are still present, even when you cannot see them. This is the quiet courage of the gardener. It is the same courage required to love in a broken world, to hope in uncertain times, to keep tending even when the harvest is not yours to see. And so the monastic garden endures, not as a relic but as an invitation to slow down, to notice, to trust the unseen work of becoming, to believe that small, faithful acts of care ripple outward in ways we may never know. You do not need a monastery to answer that invitation. You only need a patch of earth, a pot, or even just a moment of stillness beneath a tree. The garden is not a place. It is a practice, a posture, a way of walking gently through the world. It is always waiting, not as a demand, but as a gentle invitation, like the first green shoot after a long winter. And that invitation is not only for those with land or time or knowledge. It is for anyone who has ever felt weary, disconnected, or overwhelmed by the noise of the world. The garden does not ask you to be an expert. It only asks you to be present. Even in the smallest spaces, this presence can take root. A single pot of thyme on a windowsill becomes a microcosm of the old cloister gardens. Its leaves release their sharp, clean scent when brushed by a passing hand, just as they did for monks centuries ago. Its tiny flowers, if allowed to bloom, will draw bees from blocks away, stitching your little patch into the wider web of life. You do not need to understand pollination to participate in it. You only need to let the plant be. And in letting it be, you remember how to let yourself be. This is perhaps the deepest healing the garden offers. It gives us permission to exist without performing. In a world that measures worth by output, by likes, by sales, by speed, the garden operates on a different economy. Here, simply being alive is enough. A leaf does not strive to be greener. A root does not apologize for growing slowly. A flower does not compare its bloom to its neighbor. Each fulfills its nature quietly, without fanfare. The monks absorbed this lesson not through study, but through daily immersion. They walked among plants that asked for nothing but care and gave back not in profit, but in presence. Over time, that presence reshaped them. They became more like the garden, rooted, resilient, generous, and deeply attuned to the rhythms of life and rest. This attunement extended to their bodies. They knew, long before modern science confirmed it, that working with soil is good for the soul and the nervous system. The physical act of digging, weeding, planting, and harvesting grounds the mind in the body. It interrupts the spiral of anxious thoughts and returns attention to the senses. The coolness of damp earth, the roughness of bark, the warmth of sun on the back of the neck. In our age of screens and sedentary lives, this sensory reconnection is more vital than ever. We spend hours staring at flat, glowing rectangles, while our bodies cry out for texture, movement, and real-world engagement. The garden answers that cry not with instruction, but with invitation. Come, feel, breathe. And when you do, something ancient stirs within you. A memory encoded in your bones that you too belong to the earth. That you are not separate from the cycles of growth and decay, but part of them. That your breath is shared with the trees, your water with the rivers, your dust with the stars. The monks did not speak of this as ecology, but as kinship. They saw Christ in the stranger, yes, but also in the sparrow, the olive tree, the wellspring. Creation was not a resource to be managed, but a sacrament to be honored. Every act of tending was an act of worship, because every living thing bore the imprint of the divine. This vision did not require grand cathedrals. It flourished in humble courtyards where a single rosemary bush might be the only green for miles. It lived in the hands of a novice who carefully transplanted a self-seeded borage plant because it looked lonely. It echoed in the quiet laughter of brothers sharing a meal of soup made from their own leeks and herbs. And it endures today, in the urban gardener who grows tomatoes in repurposed buckets, in the schoolchild who presses wildflowers between book pages, in the elder who teaches grandchildren how to identify medicinal plants on a woodland walk. The lineage continues, not through institutions, but through gestures of care passed hand to hand, heart to heart. Even in times of crisis, this care persists. During pandemics, wars, and displacements, people have always turned to the earth. Victory gardens in wartime London, rooftop plots in besieged cities, seed exchanges among refugees. The impulse is universal. When the world feels unstable, we seek to grow something, anything, to reaffirm that life goes on. The monastic garden was born in such times. It emerged in the ruins of the Roman Empire when roads were unsafe, knowledge was vanishing, and communities were scattered. Yet in those very ruins, the monks planted. They gathered seeds like fragments of light. They copied texts like saving embers from a dying fire. They built walls not to shut the world out, but to create a space where care could take root again. Their legacy is not in stone, but in resilience, not in fame, but in faithfulness. And that faithfulness is available to us now, not as nostalgia, but as practice. You do not need to wear a habit or chant the hours. You only need to choose each day to tend something with attention, to water what matters, to pull the weeds of distraction, to trust that even small acts of care contribute to a larger healing. For the world is not healed in a day. It is healed one seed, one kindness, one quiet moment of presence at a time. And the garden, whether bounded by stone, by fence, or by nothing at all, remains a sanctuary for that healing. A place where time slows, where breath deepens, where the soul remembers its belonging. Return to it not as a retreat from the world, but as a reconnection with its deepest rhythms, the ones that hum beneath the noise of headlines, notifications, and endless demands. The garden does not deny suffering or chaos. It simply offers a different frequency, one tuned to growth, decay, renewal, and the quiet certainty that even in broken places, life finds a way to begin again. This is not optimism. It is observation. And observation, practiced long enough, becomes wisdom. The monks knew this wisdom not as theory, but as daily bread. They rose before dawn not to conquer the day, but to meet it gently, with hands ready to work, eyes open to light, hearts softened by prayer. Their labor was not separate from their spirituality. It was its embodiment. To prune a rosemary bush was to practice discernment, removing what hindered growth so the whole could flourish. To thin seedlings was to accept that abundance sometimes requires sacrifice. To compost waste was to trust that nothing is truly lost, only transformed. These were not metaphors they discussed in chapter meetings. They were truths lived in the body, learned through blisters and sunburns and the ache of kneeling on stone. And because they were lived, they stuck, not as ideas to be debated, but as bones of a quiet philosophy that shaped how they moved through the world. That philosophy was rooted in limits. The monks accepted that they could not control the weather, the soil's fertility, or the health of every plant. They worked within what was given. A rocky patch became a home for time, which thrives in poor soil. A shady corner nurtured parsley and chervil, which bolt in full sun. They did not fight the land, they listened to it. And in listening, they discovered its hidden gifts. This acceptance of limits was not resignation, it was liberation. By releasing the illusion of control, they found freedom to work with what was real. Modern life, by contrast, often insists that we can and must optimize everything: our time, our bodies, our output, our happiness. But the garden whispers otherwise. It says, some things cannot be rushed. Some wounds need time. Some seeds need darkness before they can sprout, and that is not failure, it is nature. In honoring nature, the monks honored themselves. They rested when the sun was high. They stopped work at the sound of the bell, even if the row was unfinished. They celebrated feast days with extra herbs in the stew, with flowers on the refectory table, with songs in the chapel. Joy was not postponed until some future success. It was woven into the fabric of ordinary days. And ordinary days, repeated with attention, became sacred. This sacredness was not reserved for the abbot or the scholar. It belonged to the brother who swept the paths, the one who fed the chickens, the one who stirred the salve in the still room. Every task, done with care, became a thread in the monastery's quiet tapestry of devotion. No role was too small, no act too humble. The garden reflected this democracy of dignity. Every plant had value. The lowly nettle was as honored as the fragrant rose. The creeping ground ivy, often dismissed as a weed, was gathered for its use in treating bruises and coughs. Nothing was scorned. Everything was seen. And to be seen, truly seen, is one of the deepest human longings. The garden offers this gift freely. It does not judge your past, your productivity, or your worth. It meets you as you are. If you come weary, it offers shade. If you come restless, it offers rhythm. If you come empty, it offers presence. This is why people still seek gardens in times of grief or confusion. Not to fix themselves, but to remember they are part of something larger. To feel the sun on their face and know they are still alive. To watch a bee move from flower to flower and sense, however faintly, the order beneath the chaos. The monks offered this same sanctuary to others. Pilgrims arrived with dust on their feet and sorrow in their eyes. They were given bread, broth, and a pallet in the guest house. But often what healed them most was the silence of the cloister garden, the space to simply be without explanation or expectation. In that space, tears could fall, thoughts could settle, breath could deepen. Healing, the monks understood, is not always active. Sometimes it is passive, a matter of allowing, of receiving, of letting the world hold you for a while. The garden excels at this kind of holding. Its walls, its paths, its green embrace create a container where the soul can rest without performing. And in that rest, clarity often returns, not as a shout but as a whisper. A decision becomes clear. A burden feels lighter. A path forward appears not because it was forced, but because the mind was finally still enough to see it. This is the garden's quiet magic. It does not give answers. It creates the conditions in which you can find your own. Even today, hospitals are beginning to rediscover this truth. Healing gardens are being built in medical centers, not as decoration, but as therapy. Studies show that patients with a view of greenery recover faster, need less pain medication, and report lower anxiety. The monks knew this centuries ago, not through data, but through daily witness. They saw how a walk among the herbs calmed a fevered mind, how the scent of lavender eased a troubled sleep, how the simple act of tending a plant gave purpose to those who felt lost. Their insight was not scientific, but deeply human. They understood that the body and spirit are not separate. To heal one is to tend the other. And so they tended both, through broth made with garden vegetables, through salves infused with healing herbs, through the quiet companionship of shared labor. A sick brother was not isolated. He was brought into the rhythm of the community, even if only to sit on a bench and shell peas while others worked. Belonging, they knew, was itself a medicine. This sense of belonging extended to the earth itself. The monks did not see themselves as owners of the land, but as guests, stewards, not masters. They took only what they needed. They gave back more than they took. They walked lightly, knowing that the soil beneath their feet held the bones of their ancestors and would one day hold their own. This awareness fostered a deep humility. It reminded them that they were part of a story much older and larger than themselves. Their work was not about legacy in the worldly sense, but about continuity, about passing the flame, however faintly, to the next hand. And that flame still burns, not in grand monuments, but in the quiet acts of people who choose, every day, to tend with care. The community gardener who shares extra zucchini with neighbors. The teacher who shows children how to plant beans in cups. The elder who saves seeds from her heirloom tomatoes and mails them to strangers online. These are the modern monks, untonsured, unrobed, often unaware of their lineage. Yet they carry the same quiet faith, that care matters, that small things done with love ripple outward in ways we may never see. And perhaps that is the final lesson of the monastic garden. You do not need to see the harvest to plant the seed. You only need to trust that someone, someday, will be glad you did. So plant, tend, rest, listen. The garden is waiting, not in some distant past, but right here in the soil beneath your feet, in the pot on your sill, in the quiet space between your breaths. It has always been waiting, not as a place frozen in time, but as a living current flowing beneath the surface of our hurried lives, ready to rise wherever attention is given. The garden does not demand perfection. It welcomes cracked hands, muddy knees, failed seedlings, and forgotten waterings. It asks only for return, for the willingness to come back, again and again, with humility and open eyes. This return is itself a kind of prayer, not the kind spoken in lofty words, but the kind lived in gesture, the bending of the back to pull a weed, the cupping of hands to catch rainwater, the gentle tucking of a seed into dark soil. These acts require no audience. They are offered quietly, like incense rising from a hidden altar, and in their quietness they heal not only the earth but the one who tends it. The monks understood that healing is rarely linear. Some days the garden thrived. Other days slugs devoured the lettuce overnight, or a sudden hailstorm battered the young peas. On those days they did not curse the sky. They gathered what could be saved, mended what was broken, and trusted that the cycle would continue. Their resilience was not born of stoicism, but of deep trust in the rhythm of renewal. They had seen too many springs follow too many winters to doubt that life always finds a way back. This trust seeped into their bones and shaped how they met human suffering. When a brother fell into despair, they did not offer platitudes. They invited him to walk the garden path, to feel the sun on his face, to watch the bees move among the borage. Often that was enough, not because the sorrow vanished, but because it was held by the earth, by the community, by the quiet certainty that even in darkness, roots are growing. And roots, unseen though they are, hold everything together. The monks honored them. They knew that the strength of a plant lies not in its bloom, but in its foundation. So they fed the soil, not just the leaves. They composted, rotated crops, and let beds lie fallow, not for show, but for sustainability. Their care was not superficial. It went deep. This depth is what our age so desperately needs. We skim surfaces of news, of relationships, of experiences, rarely pausing to go deeper. But the garden insists on depth. It cannot be rushed. It cannot be faked. It demands presence, patience, and a willingness to get your hands dirty. And in return, it offers something rare: authenticity. In the garden, there are no filters, no curated feeds, no performance. A plant either lives or it doesn't. A seed either sprouts or it doesn't. There is no pretending. This honesty is both humbling and liberating. It strips away illusion and leaves only what is real: earth, water, light, time, and care. The monks embraced this reality. They did not seek to dominate nature, but to collaborate with it. They observed which plants grew well together, carrots and onions, beans and corn, and planted accordingly. They noticed that planting garlic near roses deterred aphids long before pesticides existed. Their knowledge was not extracted from books alone, but from decades of quiet watching. This watching was a form of love. To truly see something, to notice how its leaves curl in drought, how its flowers open at dawn, how it leans toward the light, is to honor its existence. The monks saw the garden not as a collection of resources, but as a community of beings, each with its own dignity, its own role, its own song. And they listened to that song, not with ears alone, but with their whole being. In the rustle of leaves, they heard patience. In the unfurling of a fern, they saw hope. In the decay of last year's mulch, they sensed transformation. The garden was their teacher, their healer, their chapel. Even their architecture reflected this reverence. Cloister walks were built with open arches facing inward, so that as monks paced in meditation, their eyes would fall naturally on the green heart of the monastery. The garden was not an afterthought. It was the center, the still point around which everything else turned. This centrality was no accident. It reflected a worldview in which the sacred was not distant, but immediate, in the soil, in the seed, in the sweat of honest labor. Holiness was not reserved for saints in stained glass, but found in the daily act of tending. And that holiness is still available. You do not need stone walls or Latin chants. You only need to kneel, literally or metaphorically, and place your hands in the earth, to feel its coolness, its texture, its quiet strength. In that touch, something ancient awakens, a memory that you too are made of dust and water and breath, that you belong here. This belonging is not passive. It calls for participation, for care, for the courage to plant something even when the future is uncertain. The monks planted during plagues, during wars, during famines. They planted not because they knew the harvest would come, but because planting was an act of defiance against despair. It still is. Every seed sown in love is a quiet rebellion against a world that tells us to consume, to hurry, to look away. Every herb grown for healing is a vote for gentleness. Every flower allowed to bloom for bees is a stand for interdependence. The garden teaches that we are not alone, that our lives are woven into a vast, intricate web of giving and receiving. The bee takes nectar and gives pollination. The worm eats decay and gives fertility. The monk takes herbs and gives care. Nothing exists in isolation. Everything is in relationship. And in that relationship, there is enough. Not abundance in the sense of excess, but sufficiency in the sense of balance. The monks never hoarded. They shared what they had, trusting that the earth would provide again. This economy of enough was not scarcity mindset. It was deep trust in the generosity of life. That trust is harder to hold now, in a world of climate anxiety and social fracture. Yet the garden remains a place where it can be practiced, where you can plant one thing, tend it well, and see what grows, where you can learn slowly to let go of control and lean into care. For care is the true currency of the garden. Not yield, not beauty, not efficiency, but care. And care, when given freely, multiplies. It spreads through seeds shared, knowledge passed, hands taught. It echoes across centuries. From a 9th century monk writing a poem about his little garden, to a child, today pressing a clover into a notebook. The thread is unbroken. So keep tending, keep planting, keep listening. The garden is not a relic. It is a living invitation to slow down, to connect, to remember that you too are part of this great, green, breathing world. And it has always been waiting for you to come home. It has always been waiting, not as a static memory, but as a living pulse beneath the surface of every season, every soil, every soul that dares to kneel and listen. The garden does not belong to the past. It breathes in the present, in the rustle of leaves stirred by a breeze that has blown across centuries, in the quiet unfurling of a fern that knew the hands of monks long turned to dust. It lives in the crack of a sidewalk where a dandelion pushes through concrete, in the pot of rosemary on a city balcony, in the backyard plot where a grandmother teaches her grandchild how to thin carrot seedlings, with fingers still learning gentleness. This continuity is not accidental. It is chosen. Every time someone saves seeds from a tomato, every time someone composts kitchen scraps instead of tossing them away, every time someone pauses to watch a bee move from flower to flower, they join a lineage that stretches back through cloistered courtyards, Roman villas, Egyptian temple gardens, and beyond. The impulse to tend is ancient, primal, and deeply human. It is not about control but connection. Not about ownership but stewardship. The monks understood this stewardship as sacred duty. They did not see the earth as a commodity but as a covenant. To care for it was to honor the Creator who called it good. And that goodness was not abstract. It was in the crunch of a freshly pulled radish, the scent of crushed mint underfoot, the way sunlight dappled through apple boughs in late afternoon. Holiness was not elsewhere. It was here, in the ordinary miracle of growth. And growth, they knew, requires both light and darkness. A seed must be buried to rise. A root must stretch into shadow to support the bloom. So too with the human spirit. The garden offered space not only for joy but for grief, for sitting with loss beneath the pear tree, for weeping into the soil that would one day feed new life. There was no shame in sorrow here. Only the quiet understanding that decay feeds renewal, that endings make room for beginnings, that even in winter, life is preparing beneath the surface. This cyclical wisdom shaped their entire worldview. They did not measure time in quarters or deadlines, but in moons and solstices, in the swelling of buds and the falling of leaves. Their calendar was written in green and gold and brown, not in ink. And because they lived by this rhythm, they were never truly rushed. They worked with urgency only when necessary, during harvest, during storm, but otherwise moved at the pace of the earth itself. Steady, unhurried, patient. Patience was not passive waiting. It was active trust. It was planting garlic in October, knowing you would not see its green shoots until March. It was saving seeds from the healthiest plants, even if you would not live to see their grandchildren. It was copying a herbal by candlelight, not for fame, but so that someone, someday, might use its remedies to ease a fever or soothe a wound. This long-view thinking is rare in our age of instant gratification. We want results now, yesterday if possible, but the garden refuses to comply. It insists on its own timing, and in that insistence, it offers a quiet rebellion, a reminder that some things cannot be rushed, that depth requires time, that true nourishment grows slowly, like roots in the dark. And yet the garden is also generous with immediate gifts. The first strawberry of summer, the cool relief of shade on a hot day, the surprise of a self-seeded poppy blooming where none was planted. These small joys are not rewards for productivity. They are freely given, like grace, to anyone who shows up with open eyes. The monks collected these joys like treasures. They noticed how the morning light turned dewdrops into diamonds on spiderwebs, how the scent of thyme intensified after rain, how the sound of wind in the wheat field beyond the wall echoed the psalms they sang in chapel. They saw the sacred not in spite of the ordinary, but within it. This seeing was their greatest discipline. Not fasting, not vigils, not silence, but attention. To truly see a plant, to know its name, its needs, its season, was to enter into relationship with it. And relationship, they believed, was the heart of all holiness. That belief shaped how they treated people too. No one was too broken, too lost, too far gone. The monastery gates were open to thieves, widows, orphans, the mentally ill, the weary. All were given bread, broth, and rest. And often they were invited to help in the garden, not as labor, but as healing. To dig, to plant, to weed was to reconnect with the rhythm of life, to remember that you too can grow again. This therapeutic power of gardening is now validated by science. Horticultural therapy is used in prisons, hospitals, and veteran centers, but the monks knew it through experience. They saw how a man who could not speak of his grief could still pull weeds with care, how a child who flinched at loud voices would sit quietly among the chamomile, stroking its soft leaves. The garden did not demand words, it offered presence. And presence, over time, becomes medicine. Even now, in our fragmented world, the garden remains a place of wholeness. It integrates body, mind, and spirit. Your hands work while your thoughts settle. Your eyes feast on green while your lungs fill with clean air. Your heart slows as your feet find the rhythm of the path. In a single hour of tending, you may receive more restoration than in weeks of scrolling, consuming, or striving. This is not escape. It is return to your senses, to your breath, to the truth that you are part of a living world that does not require you to earn your place in it. You belong simply because you are here. And the garden has always known that. So come back to it. not as a project but as a practice, not as a performance but as a homecoming. The earth remembers your name, not in letters carved in stone, but in the quiet imprint of your footsteps on damp soil, in the warmth of your hands as they cradle a seedling, in the breath you exhale over rows of young lettuce at dawn. It remembers not because it keeps records, but because it receives you wholly, your joy, your grief, your silence, your song, and folds you into its endless cycle of giving and receiving. You do not need to prove yourself worthy. You only need to show up as you are, and the garden will meet you there. This meeting is not passive. It is a dialogue written in leaf and root, in sun and rain, in the slow language of growth. When you water the sage, it releases its sharp, clean scent as if in thanks. When you prune the rosemary, it sends out new shoots with quiet determination. When you leave a patch of wildflowers unmown, bees arrive like old friends returning home. The garden speaks, not in words but in response, and those who listen long enough learn its grammar. The monks learned this grammar not in a day but over lifetimes. They watched how certain plants thrived near each other, how basil whispered encouragement to tomatoes, how marigold stood guard against pests with their pungent roots. They noticed that planting by the moon's phases, though never guaranteed, often yielded stronger seedlings. They observed that soil fed with compost teemed with life, earthworms, fungi, beetles, all working unseen to build fertility. Their knowledge was not extracted from the earth, but received from it, like a gift offered slowly, humbly, over decades of faithful attention. And that attention was their true vocation. Not writing, not preaching, not even praying in the formal sense, but seeing, truly seeing. To see a plant not as a means to an end, but as a being with its own integrity, its own story, its own place in the web of life. This was the heart of their practice. And from that seeing flowed care, and from care flowed healing, and from healing flowed community. For the garden was never just for the monks. It was for the village midwife who came for yarrow to staunch bleeding. It was for the shepherd boy with a cough, given a jar of honey infused with thyme. It was for the pilgrim whose blistered feet were soaked in a basin of warm water steeped with mint and lavender. The garden's bounty flowed outward like a quiet river, nourishing not only bodies but bonds. This outward flow was not charity, it was kinship. The monks did not see themselves as givers and others as receivers. They saw all as part of one body, earth, plant, animal, human, each giving and receiving in turn. The compost gave to the soil to the herbs to the sick, the healed to the next stranger in need. Nothing was hoarded, everything circulated. This economy of circulation is the opposite of our modern extractive model, which takes without replenishing, consumes without gratitude, and isolates without connection. The monastic garden offers an alternative, a closed loop of care where waste becomes food, loss becomes soil, and generosity becomes legacy. And that legacy is not measured in monuments, but in moments, like the elderly brother who, on his deathbed, asked only to smell a sprig of borage from the garden one last time, or the novice who, years later, planted the same herbs in a new monastery far away, carrying the scent of home in his memory, or the villager who taught her daughter how to make elderflower cordial using the recipe whispered to her by a monk long gone. These moments are the true archives of the garden, not in parchment but in practice, not in stone but in seed. And seeds, more than anything, embody the garden's faith in the future. A single seed holds an entire plant in potential, a promise wrapped in husk and hope. To save seeds is to say, I believe there will be a tomorrow worth growing into. The monks saved seeds through wars, plagues, and famines. They tucked them into dry jars, labeled them with care, and stored them in cool, dark places, not because they were certain of survival, but because hope, even in darkness, must be preserved. We too carry seeds, not only of plants, but of kindness, of slowness, of attention. Every time we choose to listen instead of react, to tend instead of consume, to wait instead of rush, we plant a seed in the unseen soil of the future. We may never see it bloom, but someone will. And that is enough. For the garden has never been about the gardener. It is about life itself, persistent, resilient, generous, and always returning. Even when trampled, burned, or buried, it finds a way, a crack in pavement, a forgotten corner, a single spore carried on the wind. Life insists. So do not despair if your patch is small, your time limited, your knowledge incomplete. The garden does not require expertise. It requires presence. Show up. Water what you can. Pull one weed. Watch one bee. Breathe. In that simplicity, you join a lineage older than words. A quiet river of tenders who believed, without proof, that care matters. And it does. More than ever. It does more than ever. Because the world is hungry not for more noise, but for more nurture. Not for faster solutions, but for deeper roots. Not for grand declarations, but for quiet acts of faithfulness that say, without fanfare, I am here. I will tend what I can. This tending is not confined to soil. It extends to relationships, to communities, to the inner landscape of the soul. The same patience that allows a monk to wait for garlic to mature also allows a parent to sit with a child's unspoken grief. The same attention that notices aphids on a rose also notices the flicker of loneliness in a neighbor's eyes. The same trust that plants a seed in November also trusts that healing is possible, even when the wound is deep. The garden teaches that all tending is connected. To care for the earth is to care for each other. To honor the rhythm of rest and growth in the soil is to honor it in ourselves. To compost waste is to practice forgiveness, turning what is broken into nourishment for what is yet to come. And this practice is urgently needed now, not as escape but as resistance. In a culture that glorifies speed, the garden insists on slowness. In an economy that demands endless consumption, the garden models sufficiency. In a society that isolates, the garden weaves connection between species, between generations, between strangers who share seeds at a market stall. Even in the smallest gestures, this resistance takes root. A balcony gardener who grows peppers in repurposed buckets refuses the myth that you need land to belong to the earth. A teacher who brings students outside to plant beans challenges the idea that learning happens only behind desks. An elder who mails heirloom seeds to young farmers across the country stitches past and future together with green thread. These are not small acts, they are quiet revolutions. The monks knew this. They did not set out to change the world. They simply tended their corner of it with care, with consistency, with love. And in doing so, they preserved knowledge, healed bodies, offered refuge, and kept the flame of compassion alive through centuries of darkness. Their power was not in scale, but in steadfastness. Steadfastness is still possible. It looks like watering your herbs even when you're tired. It looks like saving seeds from your tomatoes even if you live in an apartment. It looks like pausing to watch the light shift on a leaf, even for 30 seconds in the middle of a busy day. These moments are not trivial. They are tiny acts of re-enchantment, reminders that the world is still alive, still beautiful, still worthy of our care. And that care changes us. When you grow your own food, even a single lettuce, you taste the difference, not just in flavor, but in meaning. When you make tea from mint you planted yourself, it warms you in a deeper way. When you watch a seed you buried push through the soil, you feel a quiet surge of kinship with all who have ever hoped in the unseen. This kinship is the garden's greatest gift. It dissolves the illusion of separation. You are not above the earth, you are of it. Your breath is shared with trees, your water with rivers, your dust with stars. The garden does not teach this in sermons. It reveals it in experience, when your hands are in the soil, when your knees are on the ground, when your eyes are level with the clover. In that posture of humility, something shifts. The ego softens, the heart opens, the mind quiets, and in that quiet you hear the old song again, the one that hums beneath everything. You belong, you are held, you are part of a story much larger than yourself. The monks heard this song daily. They walked its melody in the cloister paths. They sang its harmony in the chapel. They lived its rhythm in the turning of the seasons. And though their voices have faded, the song remains, in the rustle of leaves, in the buzz of bees, in the quiet miracle of a seed becoming a plant. All you need to do is listen, and tend, and return, again and again. For the garden is not a place you visit once. It is a relationship you cultivate over a lifetime. Some days you give more, some days you receive more, but always it is there, waiting not with expectation but with open arms. Yes, let us deepen into the theme itself, not as a topic to be explained, but as a presence to be inhabited. The true theme of the monastic garden was never merely horticulture, nor even healing in the narrow sense. It was sanctuary through reciprocity, the quiet understanding that to care for the earth is to be cared for in return, not by magic but by alignment. When you live in rhythm with the seasons, with the soil, with the slow pulse of growth and decay, you step out of the frantic current of human time and into the deeper river of cosmic time, the one that flows through roots, stars, and breath alike. This rhythm is the heart of the theme, wholeness restored through humble participation. The monks did not seek to transcend the world. They sought to dwell within it fully, with hands in the dirt, feet on the stone, eyes open to the green unfolding around them. Their holiness was not otherworldly, it was earthed, literally. And in that earthness they found a kind of peace that no doctrine could grant, but only practice could reveal. The garden was their classroom, their pharmacy, their chapel, and their refuge all at once because it refused division. It did not separate body from spirit, work from prayer, utility from beauty. A row of onions fed the brothers' bodies. The symmetry of the beds calmed their minds. The scent of blooming borage lifted their hearts. The act of watering at dawn became a moving meditation. Everything served everything else. Nothing stood alone. This integration is what our fragmented age so desperately lacks. We compartmentalize, work here, rest there, nature outside, technology inside, body in the gym, soul in the app. But the garden insists on unity. You cannot tend it with only your hands. You must bring your attention, your patience, your senses, your willingness to be changed by what you tend. And in that full presence, fragmentation begins to heal. That healing is the quiet promise of the theme. Not dramatic transformation, but gradual realignment, like a sapling bending toward the light, not all at once, but day by day. The monks knew this. They did not expect enlightenment in a single season. They expected small shifts, a little more patience after weeding the thyme bed, a little more trust after watching seeds sprout despite late frost, a little more gratitude after sharing soup made from their own leeks. And these small shifts accumulated. Over years, they shaped men who moved through the world with calm hands and quiet eyes, men who could sit with suffering without flinching, who could listen without fixing, who could wait without anxiety. Their strength was not in control, but in surrender to what is. This surrender is not passivity. It is active trust, the kind that plants a seed in November, knowing winter is coming, yet believing in spring. It is the courage to do what is yours to do and release the rest, to water but not command the rain, to prune but not force the bloom, to care without demanding that care be returned in kind. This is the essence of the monastic garden's theme, faithful presence in an uncertain world. And that theme is not confined to medieval cloisters. It echoes wherever someone chooses to tend with love despite the odds. In a refugee camp, a woman grows basil in a plastic bottle because green is hope. In a city alley, a teenager builds a raised bed from scrap wood because food is dignity. On a hospital rooftop, a nurse plants lavender because scent is solace. These are all monastic gardens now, not in name but in spirit. The form has changed, but the heart remains. A small, tended space where care is practiced without guarantee, where life is honored in its fragility, and where the simple act of showing up becomes a quiet act of resistance against despair. This is the theme we are invited to live, not as historians but as participants. You do not need to replicate a 9th century herb bed to embody it. You only need to ask, what can I tend today? A relationship, a patch of earth, a neglected part of yourself, a moment of stillness. Tend it gently, tend it without expectation, tend it as if it were a prayer. Because it is. And in that tending, you join the unbroken circle, the one that flows from the hands of monks in Alexandria to the hands of a child planting a sunflower in Brooklyn, from the compost heaps of Reichenau to the balcony planters of Tokyo, from the still rooms of medieval abbeys to the kitchen windowsills of today. The thread is green, the song is slow, the invitation is always open. Come, kneel. Begin not with grand plans, but with a single seed, a single breath, a single act of noticing. For the theme of the monastic garden was never about perfection, scale, or legacy in the eyes of the world. It was about fidelity to the small, the ordinary, the immediate. It was about showing up for what is in front of you, however modest, and tending it as if it mattered, because it does. This fidelity is the quiet spine of the entire tradition. The monks did not wait for ideal conditions. They gardened in rocky soil, in biting winds, in the shadow of war. They gardened with calloused hands and tired bones. They gardened not because it was easy, but because it was necessary, not just for food or medicine, but for sanity, for soul, for the preservation of a gentler way of being in a world often bent on destruction. And that necessity remains. In an age of digital overload, ecological grief, and social fragmentation, the garden offers a sanctuary not by denying reality, but by grounding us in a deeper one. The reality that life continues quietly, persistently, even in the cracks. That healing is possible, not through force, but through attention. That hope is not a feeling, but a practice. The practice of planting when you cannot see the harvest. This practice is the living core of the theme, sanctity in the everyday. The monks did not seek the extraordinary. They found the sacred in the steam rising from a pot of herb broth, in the curve of a bean tendril around its pole, in the silence shared between brothers as they weeded side by side. Holiness was not reserved for saints or scholars. It bloomed in the hands of the humblest brother who swept the paths or fed the chickens. And it blooms still, in the hands of anyone who chooses to care without needing to be seen. The theme is not about replicating history. It is about embodying its spirit in the present, to live with less noise and more presence, with less taking and more giving, with less haste and more harmony. This harmony is not passive. It is cultivated daily, deliberately, gently. It requires boundaries, the garden walls, rhythm, the liturgical hours, and intention, every seed saved, every bed tended. But within those structures there is immense freedom, the freedom to be slow, to make mistakes, to rest, to simply be. The garden teaches that structure and freedom are not opposites. A trellis does not imprison the pea vine. It gives it something to lean on so it can reach higher. The cloister walls did not trap the monks. They created a protected space where attention could deepen. In the same way, our own boundaries of time, energy, space can become trellises for our own growth, not cages. And growth in this tradition is never forced. It is invited. The monks did not yank seedlings from the ground to see if they were growing. They waited. They watched. They trusted the unseen work happening beneath the surface. They knew that roots must establish before shoots appear, and that the most important growth is often invisible. This is true for us too. The work of healing, learning, loving, it often happens in darkness, in silence, in solitude. The world may see no change, but deep within, roots are reaching, strengthening, preparing. The garden honors that hidden labor. It says, you do not need to prove you are growing, just keep tending. And tending includes rest. The monks observed the Sabbath not as a rule, but as a rhythm woven into creation itself. The land was allowed to lie fallow. The brothers ceased labor. Even God, their scriptures said, rested on the seventh day. Rest was not laziness. It was reverence for limits. It was acknowledgement that we are not machines, but living beings who need fallow seasons to remain fertile. In our time of burnout and endless productivity, this rhythm is revolutionary. To stop, to sit in the garden without doing anything, to watch clouds pass over the pear tree, to let the bees do their work while you do none. This is not wasted time. It is sacred time, the time in which the soul catches up with the body and the spirit remembers its source. The garden holds that space for us. It does not demand output. It offers presence. And in that presence we remember who we are. Not cogs in a machine, not profiles in a feed, not consumers in an economy, but participants in a living, breathing, singing world that has been waiting for us to come home. So come home, not someday, now. Not perfectly, just as you are. With muddy shoes, unanswered questions, and a heart that's been bruised by the world. The garden does not require you to be whole to enter. It offers wholeness through the simple act of returning. Let this be enough, not because the story is finished, but because the garden does not need a final word. It continues in your hands, in your attention, in the quiet choice you make today to tend something with care. The monks are gone, but their spirit lives wherever someone kneels in the soil, breathes in the scent of rosemary, or saves a seed for tomorrow. You do not need to do more. You only need to return again and again to the green heart of things. The garden is waiting. And so gently we rest here,